Hi, I'm Ethan Blake, and this is the story of how I discovered that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it's the ones closest to you who orchestrate your downfall. But I also learned that a well-planned revenge can be the sweetest form of redemption. Let me take you back to where it all began. Blake Tech wasn't always the thriving $100 million tech enterprise it is today. 15 years ago, it was a struggling IT consulting firm that my dad, Richard Blake, had built from scratch. Dad was a visionary when it came to technology but hopeless with business management. By 2010, we were just months away from bankruptcy, and his health was failing under the relentless stress. At 25, fresh out of business school, I was eager to prove myself. My older brother Kyle was 30, and better known for his flashy lifestyle and connections in the city's nightlife than his work ethic. Dad had always favored Kyle, the charming firstborn who could talk his way out of anything. But charm doesn't pay the bills, and Kyle's indulgences had already driven several key clients away. I still remember that rainy Tuesday vividly. Dad was slumped over his desk, staring at a financial report with tears in his eyes. "It's over, Ethan," he whispered, his voice raw with defeat. "Everything I worked for, gone." Something snapped in me at that moment. I couldn't let my father's dream crumble, even if he had always seen me as second best. While Kyle squandered company funds at exclusive clubs, I rolled up my sleeves and started working 18-hour days. Mom worried herself sick. "Ethan, you need rest," she'd insist, leaving a plate of food on my desk at midnight. "You can't carry this weight alone." But I did. I learned every facet of the business, met every client, and reviewed every contract. By the end of that brutal first year, I had stabilized the company. I had restructured debts, slashed unnecessary expenses, including Kyle's infamous entertainment budget, and even brought back some clients who had previously sworn off working with us. Kyle, of course, found it hilarious. "Look at you, playing the corporate savior," he'd sneer, occasionally showing up at the office to mock my efforts. "Dad's still going to put me in charge. I'm the eldest, it's tradition." I ignored him, focusing instead on rebuilding the business. Over the next 5 years, Blake Tech transformed from a small IT consultancy into a pioneering digital solutions provider. I expanded our services, created proprietary software, and cultivated a reputation for excellence. Revenue soared from $2 million to $150 million, and we crossed the $100 million milestone last year. Despite the company's meteoric rise, Dad's favoritism remained unchanged. At family dinners, he'd toast Kyle's leadership, even though everyone knew he spent more time planning vacations than working. It stung, but I kept my head down. The company's success was my true reward, not recognition. By the time Blake Tech hit its stride, I'd come to accept that my father would never see me as his equal, let alone as the one steering the ship. I told myself it didn't matter. What counted was that the company was thriving, and I was proud of what I'd built, even if I had to build it in the shadows of Kyle's undeserved spotlight. But as the company grew, so did Kyle's antics. He showed up just enough to keep Dad convinced he was contributing, all while siphoning off company funds for his personal escapades. I kept detailed records of everything: every dollar wasted, every missed meeting, every disgruntled client who walked away because of his arrogance. Not because I planned to use them, but because part of me needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. The moment that shifted everything came last month. Dad called for a shareholder meeting to announce his retirement. I'd been effectively running Blake Tech for years by then, so I figured it was a formality. The logical choice was obvious. I'd proven my capability time and time again. Even Kyle had been showing up to the office more often, which I assumed was his way of preparing for the transition. The meeting was set for a Friday afternoon. I'd spent days preparing a presentation on our 5-year growth strategy. I was ready to step into the role officially, no matter how bittersweet it felt to take over without Dad's full acknowledgement. As we gathered in the boardroom, I couldn't help but notice Kyle smirking from across the table. I brushed it off. Kyle always had an inflated sense of confidence, but it never amounted to much. Dad stood up, looking around the room with a practiced seriousness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "as you know, My time as CEO of Blake Tech has come to an end. This company has been my life's work, and deciding who should carry it forward has been one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. He paused for dramatic effect. I straightened my posture, ready to hear the words I'd been waiting for. But then he said them. My son, Kyle Blake, will be taking over as CEO, effective immediately. The air seemed to leave the room. My stomach dropped like I'd been punched. My father continued, oblivious to the shock and confusion around the table. Kyle embodies the leadership qualities needed to take this company into the future. Kyle stood, playing the part of the gracious heir. Thank you, Dad. It's an honor to carry on your legacy. I was too stunned to move. This wasn't just unfair, it was absurd. Leadership qualities? Kyle hadn't led anything in his life except bar tabs. But it got worse. Dad turned to me, his expression suddenly cold. Unfortunately, there's another matter we need to address. Kyle's smirk widened as he opened a folder. It seems Ethan has been making unauthorized decisions, risky ones at that. These actions have potentially jeopardized the company's reputation. I froze. Every word out of his mouth twisted reality. The risky decisions were the very ones that had saved Blake Tech from collapse. Kyle's delivery was smooth, polished, even sympathetic. I'm afraid we can't ignore this, he said, shaking his head. Then Dad dropped the hammer. Effective immediately, Ethan will no longer be employed by Blake Tech. 2 security guards approached my seat. This isn't happening, I whispered. But it was. Kyle stood there, playing the role of the reluctant villain, saying, I'm sorry, little brother, but it's for the best. Maybe now you can find a life outside the office. The whispers started as I was escorted out, my keycard deactivated before I even left the building. My co-workers' faces were a mix of pity and disdain, but none of them knew the truth, not yet. Because while Kyle had spent the past decade flaunting his charm and connections, I had been quietly preparing for something like this. They didn't know about the 40% ownership stake I'd accumulated through personal investments when the company was struggling. They didn't know about the meticulous records I'd kept or the backdoors I'd built into Blake Tech systems. And they certainly didn't know what was coming next. That night, as I sat in my car outside the office, I sent a single text to a friend at the SEC. Then I went home and waited. Monday was going to be interesting. Monday morning arrived with a thunderstorm, dark clouds, heavy rain, and the kind of atmosphere that feels like nature knows something big is about to happen. Fitting, I thought, as I sat in my home office, sipping coffee and watching the clock. At 9 a.m., Kyle would step into his new office as CEO of Blake Tech, completely unaware of the storm brewing just for him. The weekend had been surreal. Mom called me a dozen times, leaving teary messages about keeping the family together. Dad didn't call at all. I imagined he was too busy congratulating himself on choosing Kyle to carry on the Blake legacy. As for Kyle, social media told me all I needed to know. He'd spent the weekend celebrating his new position at the trendiest clubs in town, complete with overpriced champagne and questionable company. Pictures of him and his entourage went viral, because of course Kyle would make sure everyone knew he was the new boss. By 9:15, I got the text I'd been waiting for from Sarah, my former executive assistant. She was fiercely loyal to me, and one of the few people who saw through Kyle's act. It's starting, the message read. I smirked and opened my laptop. One of the perks of building a company's entire IT infrastructure from scratch is knowing where all the back doors are. Kyle might have stripped me of my title, but my access was another story. I connected to the internal security feed. Sure enough, there he was, waltzing into the CEO's office with a smug grin and a coffee in hand. He sank into the leather chair, my chair, like he belonged there, completely oblivious. The moment he powered up the computer, the show began. Instead of the standard login screen, a video started playing. It was security footage from 3 years ago. Kyle was sitting in that same office, leaning back with a glass of whiskey in hand, negotiating a deal with one of our biggest competitors. His voice rang out, clear as day. Of course I can get you their data. My idiot brother does all the work anyway. Just make sure the payment goes to my Cayman account. Kyle froze. He fumbled with the mouse, trying to shut it off, but nothing worked. The video wasn't just playing on his computer, it was mirrored on every screen in his office. His phone buzzed next. It was the SEC. I'd sent them a detailed package of evidence, outlining a decade's worth of Kyle's shady deals, insider trading, and embezzlement. As he read the notification, his face went pale. Then his email started pinging, one after another, messages from board members demanding answers, investors panicking, and media outlets requesting comments about allegations of misconduct. Down in the lobby, federal agents arrived. I switched to the security feed there and watched as they calmly showed their badges to the receptionist and were escorted upstairs. Kyle's reign was falling apart, and it had barely lasted an hour. By 9:30, Sarah walked into Kyle's office with the composure of someone who knew exactly what was going on. "Mr. Blake," she said, "the board has called an emergency meeting. Also, there are federal agents here to speak with you." Kyle stammered, "Tell them I'm busy. Cancel everything until IT fixes these computers." Sarah smiled politely. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The IT department resigned this morning. They sent a company-wide email explaining their decision. Something about loyalty to the person who actually built this company." Kyle's jaw dropped. "They can't do that. We have contracts." "Actually," Sarah replied, setting a folder on his desk, "their contracts were with a subsidiary company, one that's no longer affiliated with Blake Tech." Confused, Kyle opened the folder. Inside were the documents outlining the ownership of a company I'd quietly established years ago, Blake Innovation Solutions. It held all the patents, software, and intellectual property that made Blake Tech valuable. I owned 100% of it. "The clients," Kyle stammered, sweat forming on his brow. Sarah nodded. "Most have already signed new contracts with Blake Innovation Solutions. They seem to prefer working with the person who's been managing their accounts all these years." The color drained from Kyle's face. His perfect little empire was crumbling faster than he could process. The office door swung open, and 2 federal agents stepped in. "Kyle Blake?" one of them asked. "We need to speak with you about some financial discrepancies." Kyle's protests fell on deaf ears as they escorted him out of the building, his designer suit rumpled, his confidence shattered. On the way out, he passed a swarm of reporters, cameras flashing, all eager to document the fall of the new CEO of Blake Tech. I leaned back in my chair, watching it all unfold through the security feeds. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, board members, and even a few journalists, all trying to make sense of the chaos. I ignored them. This was just the beginning. By the time Kyle was escorted out of Blake Tech's headquarters in handcuffs, I knew the company's fate was sealed. News travels fast, especially when it's juicy. Within hours, headlines like "Tech CEO arrested for fraud" and "Blake Tech in crisis, scandal erupts" were plastered across every major business outlet. The stock price plummeted almost 70% before the market even closed. That was the chaos I needed. While the world focused on Kyle's downfall, I was working quietly from my new office at Blake Innovation Solutions, a sleek building I'd purchased months ago in anticipation of this exact moment. By late afternoon, Sarah joined me. Her face lit up with the kind of energy you only get when things are going exactly as planned. "The team's in," she said, setting a tablet on my desk. On it was a list of names. Almost every key employee from Blake Tech had accepted my offer to join Blake Innovation Solutions. "Every department?" I asked. Legal, sales, development," she confirmed. "Even a few people from accounting who swore they'd never leave." She paused, smirking. "Guess loyalty matters more than free booze at Kyle's parties." I smiled but didn't say anything. This wasn't just about loyalty. It was about respect. These people had been treated like pawns for years, their hard work ignored while Kyle basked in the spotlight. They knew where the real leadership came from, and they were finally free to follow it. But the best part? The clients were just as eager to jump ship. By the next morning, Over 90% of Blake Tech's major accounts had signed new contracts with my company. I made sure to personally call each one, thanking them for their trust and promising them a brighter future. Their confidence in me felt like vindication for all the years I'd spent cleaning up Kyle's messes. The fallout hit Dad harder than I expected. For years, he'd put every ounce of faith into Kyle, blind to the damage his favoritism caused. But now that faith had come back to bite him, his entire retirement fund was tied up in Blake Tech stock, which was now worth pennies on the dollar. By Wednesday, I got a call from his financial advisor, Mr. Goldman. "Ethan, your father's struggling," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "Your mother's worried. They might lose the house." I leaned back in my chair, taking a long moment to think. It wasn't that I wanted them to suffer. I wasn't heartless. But I couldn't ignore the years of dismissal and condescension, the countless times Dad had looked the other way while Kyle ran amok. "Set up a meeting," I said finally. "Tomorrow morning, at my office." The next day, Mom and Dad walked into Blake Innovation Solutions looking like they'd aged a decade overnight. Mom's eyes were red and puffy, her face lined with worry. Dad's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow expression I'd never seen before. They sat across from me in the same uncomfortable visitor chairs Dad used to make me sit in whenever he lectured me about real leadership. "Son," Dad began, his voice unsteady. "I know we've had our differences, but stop." My tone was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "This isn't about differences, Dad. This is about accountability." He flinched but stayed silent. "You let Kyle destroy this company," I continued, my voice steady. "You helped him cover up his mistakes, and when I tried to save it, you fired me without a second thought." "I didn't know," he stammered. "You knew," I shot back. "You just didn't care, because to you, Kyle was always the golden boy, and I was the backup plan." Mom started crying softly. I handed her a tissue but kept my focus on Dad. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Blake Innovation Solutions will buy back your shares at their original purchase price. That should be enough to cover your retirement." Dad's eyes lit up with hope, but I held up a hand to stop him. "There are conditions. First, you sign a non-disclosure agreement about everything Kyle did. Second, you retire quietly to that house in Florida you've always talked about. And third, you stay out of my business. Completely." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You don't trust us." I leaned forward, my gaze unflinching. "You taught me not to." For a moment, I thought he'd argue, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll sign." Mom wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Ethan." I nodded, but didn't respond. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about closure. They signed the papers, and as security escorted them out, Dad turned back one last time. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "You're a better businessman than I ever was." "No, Dad," I replied. "I'm just better at recognizing my real enemies." As the door closed behind them, I took a deep breath and looked out the window. Blake Innovation Solutions was thriving, and I finally felt free. The people who mattered, my team, my clients, my supporters, were with me. And the people who didn't, they were out of my life for good. The aftermath of Kyle's downfall sent shockwaves through the industry. Blake Tech was a shell of its former self. No intellectual property, no major clients, and a gutted workforce. The stock continued its nosedive, hitting rock bottom within days. Analysts called it one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in recent history. But at Blake Innovation Solutions, the mood was entirely different. My team hit the ground running, fully committed to building something new. With the weight of Blake Tech's dysfunction finally lifted, it felt like we could breathe again. I spent my days meeting with clients, ensuring a seamless transition to their new contracts. They appreciated the personal attention, and more importantly, they trusted me. Many admitted they'd stayed with Blake Tech for years solely because of my involvement. Hearing that felt like vindication after years of being overshadowed by Kyle. The nights were quieter, but not in a bad way. For the first time in years, I wasn't consumed by stress or resentment. I'd won. And as I sat in my new office, a sleek space overlooking the city skyline, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company Dad and Kyle had tried so hard to control was now irrelevant. Meanwhile, the company I'd quietly built, the one they'd dismissed as insignificant, was thriving. And it was mine. Fully, completely mine. But as satisfying as it was to see Kyle and Dad face the consequences of their choices, I wasn't entirely free from the shadows of the past. Every so often, I'd catch myself wondering if I'd done the right thing. Not about taking over. There was no doubt in my mind that Blake Innovation Solutions was better off without them. But about the way it all unfolded. Did I owe my family more compassion? Should I have handled things differently? The thoughts crept in during quiet moments, but they didn't linger long. The truth was, compassion had been a luxury I couldn't afford, not when they'd betrayed me so thoroughly, not when they'd forced me out of the company I'd poured my soul into. They made their choices, and so did I. 5 weeks after Kyle's arrest, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A major industry publication ran an in-depth expose on Blake Tech's collapse. The headline read, "From Golden Boy to Scapegoat, the untold story of Kyle Blake's downfall." The article laid everything bare: the fraud, the embezzlement, the backdoor deals with competitors. It painted Kyle as a reckless opportunist and Dad as an enabler who turned a blind eye to his son's misdeeds. But it didn't stop there. Halfway through the piece, there was a section about me. It detailed my years of quiet leadership, the sacrifices I'd made to save Blake Tech, and the strategic moves that led to the creation of Blake Innovation Solutions. The writer called it a masterclass in resilience and foresight. Reading it felt surreal. For so long, I'd operated in the background, never seeking recognition. Now, the world knew the truth. That same week, I received an invitation to speak at my old business school. The topic: the importance of integrity in family business. I almost laughed when I saw it. The irony was too perfect. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had something valuable to share. The night before the event, I went through my notes, thinking about how I wanted to frame the story. It wasn't just about revenge or even redemption. It was about survival, about proving that integrity and hard work could triumph over arrogance and entitlement. When the day arrived, I stood in front of a packed auditorium filled with students eager to learn from someone who'd been in the trenches. I started with a simple truth. In business, just like in life, your greatest enemies aren't always the ones you expect. Sometimes they're the people you trust the most. The room was silent as I recounted the rise and fall of Blake Tech, the betrayal by my family, and the relentless drive it took to build something better. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I also didn't dwell on the bitterness. This wasn't about dragging Kyle or Dad through the mud. It was about showing the students that even in the face of betrayal, there's a path forward. I ended with a message I hoped would stick with them. While the peacocks are busy showing off their feathers, the eagles are watching, waiting, and planning their next move. Because in business, it's not about who starts at the top, it's about who's still standing when the dust settles. The applause was deafening. 5 years have passed since Blake Tech's collapse and the chaotic fallout that followed. In that time, Blake Innovation Solutions has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We're now a billion-dollar company with offices in 6 countries, a reputation for cutting-edge technology, and a culture that values integrity as much as innovation. The irony: everything I built came from the ashes of the company Dad and Kyle tried to control. Blake Tech exists in name only now, a bankrupt entity that makes the occasional headline as a cautionary tale. It's a symbol of arrogance and poor leadership, a sharp contrast to the thriving enterprise I've created. Kyle served 2 years in federal prison for fraud and insider trading. I hear he's living in Vegas now, working as a bartender at some rundown casino. He's still the same Kyle, though, posting photos on social media of exclusive parties and VIP access that no one believes. Every so often, someone forwards me one of his posts with a snide comment, but I don't engage. Kyle has nothing to do with my life anymore, and I prefer it that way. As for my parents, they've settled into a quiet retirement in Florida. I keep my distance, but Mom occasionally sends me postcards with pictures of sunsets and beaches. Her messages are simple. Thinking of you, love, Mom. I never reply, but I always keep the postcards in a drawer. Dad doesn't reach out, and I don't expect him to. The last time we spoke, he told me I was a better businessman than he ever was. I think that was the closest he'll ever come to an apology. The truth is, I've moved on. My life is full now, filled with purpose and people who respect what I've built. I no longer wake up angry or go to bed feeling unappreciated. The bitterness that fueled me for so long has given way to something else, something better: pride. Not the flashy kind that Kyle used to flaunt, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing you've earned everything you have. Last week, I was back at my alma mater, speaking to a new group of business students. It's become a tradition now. Every year, they invite me to share my story and my perspective on leadership. This time, one of the students asked a question that stuck with me. Do you regret what happened with your family? The room went silent as everyone waited for my answer. I thought about it for a moment, choosing my words carefully. I regret that it had to happen the way it did, I said honestly. But I don't regret standing up for myself. Sometimes, the people you love will let you down. Sometimes, they'll betray you. And when that happens, you have two choices. Let it break you, or let it build you into something stronger. I chose the second option. After the lecture, as the students filed out, the dean approached me with a smile. You've come a long way, Ethan, she said warmly. You must be proud. I am, I replied, and for the first time, I realized I truly meant it. That night, as I sat in my office overlooking the city, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The betrayal, the hard work, the victories, and even the losses, they all led me to this moment. And while the scars from my past will always be there, they no longer define me. They're just reminders of where I've been and how far I've come. The world moves on, and so have I. But every so often, I look back, not with anger or regret, but with gratitude. Because in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't taking down Blake Tech or exposing Kyle. It was building something so successful, so unshakable, that the people who doubted me have no choice but to live with the knowledge that they bet on the wrong person. And that's a victory no one can take away. Story 2. I'm Tessa, and I've been employed in Europe for the past year or so. For me, it's been a positive shift, a new beginning, new people, and new experiences. I left my parents and my younger sister Janet behind when I returned home. To be honest, though, we weren't exactly a close-knit family. If you can call it that, Janet and I have this strange relationship. Since she is 8 years younger than I am, we have always been in separate phases of life. She was still playing with dolls when I was coping with the drama of high school. I had already graduated from college and was concentrating on my job by the time she reached adolescence. We essentially lived in separate universes, only coming into contact on holidays and for family dinners. We no longer communicate much other than to wish each other a happy birthday and a Merry Christmas before we go overseas. Back home, I lived in a lovely apartment that had formerly belonged to my grandmother. The way that happened is amusing. I got an excellent career in finance after graduation and started earning a respectable salary. After working for 3 years, I made the decision to buy my own home instead of continuing to rent. My parents then brought up the flat my grandmother had bequeathed to my mother in her will. During supper one evening, Mom informed me that we have been renting it out. However, we may sell it to you if you're interested. It appeared more ideal the more I about it. I was intimately familiar with that apartment, Grandma's amazing chocolate chip cookies, the warm kitchen, and all the Sunday afternoons spent visiting her and helping her water her favorite plants on the balcony. The location was excellent, and the pricing was reasonable. I thus purchased it, gave them $120,000, and moved in for the following 3 years. Then the European chance presented itself. Better pay, the opportunity to travel, and new challenges were too wonderful to refuse. Of course, I retained the flat. Since it was my first significant investment, I reasoned that I could always return to it later or rent it out. Janet's name appeared on my phone while I was browsing through some business emails at my desk at my apartment in Brussels. In fact, I took a second look. It seems like an eternity had passed since we had a genuine chat. I merely looked at the screen for a while, wondering if something was amiss. "Hi there," I said, attempting not to seem surprised. "Tessa." "Hello." Janet sounded happy, which was puzzling and comforting at the same time. "How are you? How are things at work? Do you have a partner?" The inquiries arrived, fast-paced, as though we were close sisters who frequently checked in on one another. I explained my work to her, said I was single but concentrating on my profession, and that I wasn't sure when I would return home. Janet remarked, "That's actually perfect," and I could hear the joy on her face. "I recently enrolled in college. Did your parents tell you?" "No." I said, "They didn't mention it." Nor had we spoken much in a while. "Yes, I did. And you know what? My parents agreed to let me reside in your apartment while I'm a college student. Isn't it fantastic? I won't have to pay for transportation because it's only 2 blocks from college. Additionally, it will be a tremendous assistance because I won't have to pay rent." I took a deep breath and tightened my grasp on my phone as I tried to comprehend what I had just heard. Janet's nonchalant announcement of her intention to move into my apartment made my fury boil. I made an effort to speak steadily. "Wait a minute, Janet," I interrupted her eager preparation. "You cannot simply decide to move in. I should have been the first to question you about this. Didn't your parents ask you?" Janet sounded really perplexed. "Why, it was okay, according to Mom and Dad." I repressed my mounting annoyance by pinching the bridge of my nose. "Because it is my permission, not theirs, that you require. Just because they stated so doesn't mean you can move in. However, they stated that they didn't care what they said." I yelled, then instantly felt bad about my tone. I spoke a little softer. "I know you're trying to sort out your living situation, Janet, but this isn't going to work." Janet spoke again after a pause on the other end of the telephone. The tone of her voice was the same frustratingly serene one our mother adopted when she believed she was acting rationally. "Why not? I don't see. Europe is where you are. Just sitting there, empty, is the apartment." "It's not just sitting there," I corrected her. "What occurs when I make the decision to return home? I might come back from Europe at any moment. Where am I expected to reside?" My jaw tightened as Janet gave a little laugh. "Come on, Tessa. At work you earn a lot of money. You can simply rent a different location if you return. You can afford it, after all." I sat in stunned silence for a moment, stunned by her suggestion that I should rent another apartment while she lived my apartment for free. The belief that I should simply give her my house because I had a good job. It was unthinkable. "No," I said firmly. I called out. "Not at all. If you want to live there for free, I won't rent you another place." "Janet, this isn't happening. It's Mom and Dad. What my parents say doesn't matter to me." I almost yelled. "No," is the response, without awaiting her answer. I ended the call. I placed it on my desk with trembling hands. I tried to divert my attention with work for the next few hours, but I was unable to concentrate. I kept thinking about the conversation I had with Janet. It wasn't over, I knew. In our family, nothing ever ended with just one conversation. Sure enough, just as I was heating up leftovers for dinner, my phone started buzzing. Mom's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice, taking deep breaths and preparing myself for what was coming. Finally, I answered. "Hello, Tessa." My mother's voice had that particular tone. I knew all too well. The one that meant I was in trouble, like I was still a teenager who'd broken curfew. "We need to talk about what happened with Janet." I moved to my couch, abandoning my dinner. "Yeah, I guess we do. I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this." She started in, "You shouldn't treat your sister like this. She's family. It's just for a little while. While she's in college. Nothing terrible will happen if Janet stays in the apartment." I ran my fingers through my hair, fighting to keep my voice level. "Mom, I can't just let her move in there. What happens when she doesn't want to leave? I'm not going to end up fighting with my sister to get her out of my apartment." "Oh, don't be dramatic," Mom scoffed. "That won't happen. You don't know that." I countered. Besides, why can't you guys help her rent her own place? Why does it have to be my apartment? There was a slight pause before Mom answered. We've already spent all our money on Janet's college tuition. We can't afford to pay rent. On top of that, I stood up and started pacing my living room. Well, I don't want her living there. Who knows what could happen to the place? And besides, I'm renting it out right now. I'm getting income from that apartment. If Janet moves in, I'll be the one paying the bills while she lives there for free. Well, I could hear her trying to think of a response unless I added, You and Dad want to pay me rent for Janet to live there. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then my mother's voice came back, sharp and angry. I can't believe how brazen and selfish you're being, demanding rent from your own sister. What's gone into you? Selfish. Now I was the one becoming irritated. How is it selfish to want to maintain my own apartment? The flat that I bought with my own money. What did you forget? That I paid you and Dad $120,000 for it? That has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with this. I was virtually yelling. Right now, I didn't receive this flat for free. I bought it with my money, my hard-earned money. The line fell silent the next week, dragging by in total stillness. No calls from Mom. Janet didn't leave any messages. Nothing. I tried to ignore the knot in my gut that was becoming worse every day as I poured myself into my job. I jumped every time my phone buzzed. However, it was never them. My phone began vibrating in my pocket when I was in the middle of a presentation at work. Whoever it was phoned 3 more times during my lunch break, but I chose to ignore it. At last, I made sure it was out. Sarah, Mom, sister. Despite our lack of intimacy, Mom had always been the voice of reason in family conflicts. Tessa. Over the telephone, her voice was recognizable. How are things in your family? Your mother didn't seem like herself when I spoke with her just now. With a groan, I shut the door to my office. It's a mess. Sarah, too. I told the entire narrative over the course of the following 20 minutes. Mom's response, Janet's call, everything. Sarah made just faint acknowledging noises as she listened without interjecting. When I was done, she remarked, I see. Have you made another attempt to speak with Janet? Calmly? It sounds as though there may be a miscommunication here. What might possibly be misinterpreted? Slumping in my chair, I asked, For Janet, they want my flat. That's it, honey. Sarah's voice was forceful but compassionate. Things aren't always as easy as they appear. Give your sister a call. Video. To view each other's faces, give her a call. Make an effort to comprehend her perspective and ensure that she is aware of yours as well. Something about her tone made me change my mind, even if I wanted to protest. Perhaps she was correct. After work that night, we might need to make amends. I inhaled deeply before starting a video chat with Janet. She responded almost instantly, which surprised me. Her normally tidy hair was pulled back in an untidy ponytail, and she seemed exhausted. Hello, I remarked, attempting to seem neutral. Can we have a conversation? Janet nodded, her face reserved. Something has to make sense to me. I got begun. Why do you insist on residing in this specific apartment? Why not rent a home of your own? Janet's expression grew a little sterner. Why should I choose another place to rent when my parents agreed to let me remain in their apartment? You spent 4 years there. It's my time now. It was all right, they said. It seemed as if someone had hit me. Their flat? Yes. Janet raised her chin and replied, The apartment of Mom and Dad. It was a gift from their grandmother. Recall that they told I may temporarily reside there while attending college, exactly like you did. I simply gazed at her via the screen. Then, silently, I grabbed my laptop and opened my files. I have something to show you, Janet. I opened the folder with my property paperwork and shared my screen. This is not the apartment where Mom and Dad live. Years have passed since then. Examine the date. On this selling date, examine the buying agreement. They sold me this flat. For that, I gave them $120,000. There was complete stillness after that. Janet studied the papers, her eyes widening. She opened her mouth a little. However, but, she muttered, that's not possible. They informed me. They said. She gave a headshake. There's no logic about this. They would lie about this, but why? They sold you the flat, but how could they have forgotten? As Janet analyzed the materials I had handed her, I observed her expression on my computer. She appeared white, bewildered, and seemingly younger than she had been only a few minutes before. A wave of pity for my sister washed over me. I tried to lighten the situation by saying, "Well, the funds, at least, were donated to a worthy cause. Your college tuition was covered by it, according to Mom." Janet's head jerked upwards. "What?" "The proceeds from the selling of the unit," I clarified. "According to Mom, they used it for your schooling." Janet laughed in an odd way, almost like she was crying. "I have a full scholarship, Tessa. My parents haven't contributed a dime to my schooling." It was my turn to look in disbelief now. However, Mom just informed me last week that since they had already used up all of the funds for your tuition, they were unable to assist you with rent. As we both processed this new information, we sat in startled silence. Then Janet raised her voice, a little shaky. "Do you recall my desire for those middle school dancing classes?" she inquired. "Mom informed me that since they had recently purchased a new laptop for you for college, they couldn't afford it." "What?" I gave a head shake. "They never gave me a laptop. I purchased one with the money I saved from my summer work." Janet bent toward her monitor. "And do you recall my desire to attend that summer camp, the event that all of my pals were going to? I filed for fee exemptions, but Mom said they couldn't send me because they had recently covered your college application costs." "Slowly," I said. "They informed me they had spent all their money on your new school uniforms, so I applied to colleges on my own." "Uniforms for school?" Janet raised her eyebrows. "There weren't even uniforms at my school." Over the course of the following hour, we exchanged anecdotes, each one more illuminating than the last. Every time one of us requested anything, a pattern became apparent. Our parents had blamed their recent financial outlays on the other sister for their incapacity to furnish it. It was like assembling a puzzle in which not a single component fit the overall design. We had been raised to believe. I gave Sarah a call the next morning. Everything Janet and I had learned was making my head spin, and I needed another viewpoint. "Sarah, Aunt." As soon as she responded, I said, "Janet and I spoke yesterday night. We discovered that our parents had been deceiving us for many years. Each of us would be informed that they couldn't purchase anything, as they had already spent money on the other. However, none of it was accurate. When they sold the flat to me years ago, they assured Janet it was still theirs. Although Janet is on a scholarship, they informed me they used the proceeds from the sale to pay for her college education. Nothing adds up." On the other end of the telephone, Sarah took a big breath once I heard it. Her voice was thick with what sounded like long-held shame as she spoke. "Honey, Tessa, take a seat. I have to tell you something concerning your parents. I ought to have told you this years ago. However, I didn't want to upset the family. You should know the truth about how your parents actually handled you and your sister, in my opinion." I waited for Aunt Sarah to continue while sitting on my couch with my phone close to my ear. After what seemed like minutes of stillness, she eventually spoke again, this time with a tone of remorse in her voice. "Your folks? They were not what you had assumed. Tessa, contrary to what they usually said, they weren't having financial difficulties. Your granny." Each month, she handed them money, a good lot, especially for Janet and you. My hand gripped the phone more tightly. "What are you saying? Just for us?" Sarah emphasized that she wanted to ensure the well-being of her grandchildren. "However, your parents chose to spend that money on themselves. The very least was given to you ladies. They get you the most basic essentials while they shop for the cheapest groceries for your home." She hesitated as though she was having trouble pronouncing the words, but she wasn't. They lived like kings behind everyone's backs. So I asked, even though I didn't want to know. They were always dining at fancy restaurants, shopping at upscale shops, and taking business trips 2 or 3 times a year. My stomach dropped. They constantly claimed to have to travel for work, Mom and Dad. TSA did not allow business travel. They were opulent getaways. You ladies would be left with your grandma, who would be informed that they were moving to a place with an undesirable environment for kids. At actuality, they were taking cruises and lodging at 5-star resorts. You and Janet stayed behind and lived it up. Memories began to return. Grandma's is where they used to drop us off. In the vehicle trunk were their matching luxury luggage. They usually seemed so thrilled before these business trips, I recalled. How they had returned calm and tanned. Now everything made terrible sense. How did you learn about it? I was able to inquire. Aunt Sarah let out a long sigh. An accident occurred. One day, while your mother was supposed to be on a business trip, I happened to run into her in a very fancy restaurant. She had on brand new luxury clothes and jewelry that I had never seen before. She trailed off when I questioned her about it, and when she did, I could hear the anguish in her voice. "Tessa, your mom threatened me. She threatened to turn your grandma against me if I informed her about any of this. She was skilled at manipulating your grandma into believing she was infallible. Your mother promised to ensure that I was completely excluded from the bequest. And for all this time, you kept this a secret." I couldn't help but make the charge. Sarah's voice broke during our heated argument. It was years before I spoke to your mother again. Yes, I remained silent. Now, Tessa, I feel so embarrassed about it. I ought to have raised my voice, ought to have taken action. However, I was scared, and I really apologize. Janet and you were worthy of better. The truth is something you deserve to know. As my aunt's disclosures dawned on me, I sat in startled silence. All those years, all those recollections of frugal living and cautious planning. Everything had been false. My folks hadn't been having any trouble. They had been overspending. Not on us, though. This is unbelievable. At last, I was able to state that we had a very thrifty life. Mom would spend hours clipping coupons and advising us to handle our money carefully. We never went on a vacation with them, not one. Janet and I bought everything we owned from bargain stores or sale racks. Our groceries, too. I laughed resentfully. We had to be frugal, so Mom would travel across town to buy at the less expensive grocery. I got up and began to pace my apartment because I was too restless to remain still. What's the worst thing, you know? They made us feel bad about our desires, typical items that children desire. If we requested new clothes or wanted to go on field trips, they would give us a lecture about being materialistic. Sarah and Tessa got started, but I was unable to stop at this point. As well as college. God, I'm so mad right now over the college situation. You know what they used to tell me when I was a child? They instilled in me the belief that they were unable to provide financial assistance for education. They told that because there was no other option, I had to work hard in my studies and apply for scholarships. Because I believed that my future hinged on receiving flawless marks, I was scared of receiving any lower than that throughout my time in high school. Years of tension and worry were leaking out of my voice, and I could hear it. Sarah and Janet put forth a lot of effort to get their scholarships, just as I did. Both of us did. Now, since you're telling me that your grandmother left certain instructions in her will, Sarah discreetly interrupted. She gave your mother some extra cash, a sizable sum designated for both of your college educations. The inheritance was contingent on it. That money was meant to be used by your mother to pay for Janet's and your college education. My fingers were suddenly numb, and the phone almost fell out of them. What? Your grandma wished for both of her grandchildren to have a quality education. She understood the significance of that. I felt as though I had been knocked out of my breath and collapsed back onto the couch. However, Janet and I both received scholarships to attend college. We never received a dime for tuition from them. They said they were unable to pay for it. I understand, remarked Aunt Sarah quietly. Just like they retained the monthly payment your grandma provided them to take care of you, they kept all that money for themselves. I asked for an emergency leave of absence from work the next morning. My supervisor must have heard my voice since he gave his approval right away. I was flying home within 48 hours. After we met at the airport, Janet and I spoke about everything, including Sarah's revelation during the trip to her dorm room. The fact that they did this to us is unbelievable, Janet continued, her fingers white from holding on to the driving wheel so tightly. They always made us feel bad about desiring stuff. That afternoon, we got to our parents' house. The way everything appeared normal was odd. They had argued that the costly automobile in the driveway and the well-kept grass were essential company expenses. Over the years, how many falsehoods had we fallen for? Mom smiled when she answered the door, but it soon vanished when she saw us both standing there. What's this about, girls? We must speak." As I walked by her and inside the home, I stated forcefully, "Dad, where are you?" She said, "In his study," and trailed us through the house. "What's happening?" We discovered Dad using his iPad to read stuff while seated at his desk. As we filed into the room, he looked up, startled. "This is surprising, to be sure. Everything is known to us." I mentioned, without making any effort to be polite, the money that Grandma left for our college tuition and the money she provided you each month. Almost anything. The room's temperature appeared to drop by a few degrees. As Dad carefully put down his iPad, Mom's expression became blank. "Eb," Sarah informed us. "Janet broke the ice by talking about how you spend the money on upscale dining establishments, pricey trips, and yourself. As we were shopping at bargain stores and eating inexpensive meals, I anticipated rejection. Anger was what I anticipated. I was surprised by my mother's cool, even contemptuous reaction. "Well," she remarked, adjusting her high-end blouse, "I failed to see the point of discussion. Nothing went wrong on our end. We nurtured you, fed you, and clothed you. We cannot be accused of abusing children." "Nothing is wrong." My voice was rising. "Grandma gave you money especially for us, but you spent it on yourselves. We led the kind of life we were entitled to," Dad added, sounding just as unconcerned. "We were free to spend the money any way we pleased. Your funds." Janet broke her tone. "Grandma's money was involved. You got it from her on our behalf." Mom dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "The done is the done. Anyhow, you can't prove anything right now. It's long since gone." The nonchalant manner in which they acknowledged it without showing any guilt or embarrassment felt like a punch to the body. They were no longer even attempting to deny it. They just didn't give a damn. "What do you know?" I said, feeling remarkably at ease. "You're correct. The funds are no longer there. However, so is our connection with you." After leaving that house, Janet and I didn't turn around. 6 months have passed since then. Now, things are different, better in a lot of ways. Janet and I speak virtually daily. I pay her rent and assisted her in finding a lovely apartment close to university. The least I can do for my little sister is this. She insisted on being as independent as possible and secured a part-time work at a nearby coffee shop to help pay for her other bills. Janet and I went to her new house for supper last week. For hours, we shared tales and made plans for the future while laughing and chatting. Our parents may have taken our money, but they unintentionally gave us something priceless in exchange, I realized as I looked at her across the table. They used falsehoods to attempt to keep us away, but in the end, they brought us closer than ever. Story 3. The morning of my father's burial was chilly and overcast. The weather was appropriate for the most important event of my life. As my stepsister Vanessa's comments from last night's wake replayed in my mind, I stood in front of the mirror, making the greatest adjustments to my plain black dress on a research assistant pay. "But at least you could pretend to dress decently, Sarah. Having you here is embarrassing enough." Dr. David Chen, my father, was a family disappointment, despite being a great scientist. My stepmother claims that Isabella passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack in his tiny laboratory on the outskirts of the city, where he had spent many nights after being expelled from the family home 5 years prior. Isabella claimed that his fixation on unsuccessful experiments had become intolerable. The Chen family estate, a large house that had formerly been my boyhood home, was the location of the burial. As I passed past the elaborate gates, I suddenly felt as though I was in enemy territory. Memories came flooding back. In the kitchen, Dad is teaching me chemistry by experimenting with vinegar and baking soda. When I questioned him about his studies, his eyes brightened. "Look who made the decision to appear." Isabella's words interrupted my daydream. She was a vision in designer black, standing at the top of the marble stairs beside my stepsister, her immaculately manicured hand resting on the banister. Vanessa grinned, and the two of them appeared to be at a fashion show rather than a funeral. I said softly, "It's my father's funeral. I'm here, of course. Yes, your dad." A chilly smile curved Isabella's lips. Dr. Chen was a brilliant man who put his valuable experiments ahead of his family's reputation. "Sarah, tell me, Did he ever get anything useful out of that rusty lab of his? Or did he pass away as a failure? Despite my hands clenching into fists, I maintained a steady voice. There was nothing wrong with my father. Really? Vanessa's diamond earrings caught the light as she spoke. Did he live in that filthy little lab for that reason? As we uphold the family's social status. Face it, Sarah, he was an embarrassment, just like you. The funeral service was torture. I sat in the back row watching as Isabella played the grieving widow, perfectly accepting condolences from Silicon Valley's elite with graceful nods and dainty dabs at dry eyes. The true irony was that half these people hadn't spoken to my father in years. Not since Isabella had systematically cut him off from his social circles. And now the priests announce, Dr. Chen's widow would like to say a few words. Isabella glided to the podium, a picture of elegant grief. David was a dreamer, she began, her voice thick with fake emotion, perhaps too much of a dreamer. He chose to pursue his unique ideas rather than focus on our family business. But he was a good man in his way. I wanted to scream. This woman had no right to talk about my father. She hadn't seen him in the last 5 years, hadn't witnessed his dedication, his passion, his absolute certainty that he was on the verge of something revolutionary. After the service, as people began to disperse, Isabella cornered me by the refreshment table. Now, about your father's lab, she said, dropping all pretense of grief. I'll be sending people to clear it out tomorrow. Whatever junk left behind will be disposed of. You can't do that, I protested. That lab was his life's work. Actually, I can. The property belongs to Chen Industries, which, as CEO, I control completely. Your father was merely allowed to use it out of my generosity. She smiled, showing perfect white teeth. Unless, of course, you can afford to buy it. We both knew I couldn't. My salary as a research assistant barely covered my rent in a tiny apartment. I fought not, Isabella continued. Do not be concerned. I'll have them throw away his things with all the respect they deserve. She paused, examining her manicure. Oh, and Sarah, don't bother coming back to the mansion, now that your father is gone. There's really no reason for us to maintain any pretense of family ties. I left the funeral with tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead of going home, I drove straight to Dad's lab. The small industrial building looked shabby compared to the mansion, but to me it had always felt more like home than that cold, perfect house ever did using my key. The one thing Dad had insisted I always keep. I entered the lab, the familiar smell of metal and chemicals wrapped around me like a comfort blanket. Everything was exactly as he left it, equations scrawled on whiteboards, computer screens displaying complex molecular structures, and his old leather notebook sitting on a main workbench. That notebook. Dad had carried it everywhere, constantly making notes, drawing diagrams, muttering about getting the sequence right. Isabella had always mocked it, calling it his book of failures. With trembling hands, I picked it up. The leather was worn soft from years of use, the pages dog-eared and coffee-stained. As I opened it, a letter fell out, addressed to me in my father's messy handwriting. My dearest Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, something has occurred to me. I need you to know that all I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, it wasn't for nothing. The formulae in this notebook, they work. The molecular stabilization sequence is complete. But there are individuals who would murder for this technology, people who wouldn't grasp the need of utilizing it ethically. That's why I could never tell Isabella or go public until it was ready. My palms started trembling as I read further, the unsuccessful efforts Isabella had scorned. They were preliminary experiments for a new carbon capture technique, a procedure that might physically suck greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and turn them into sustainable electricity. If this succeeded, it would be worth billions, maybe trillions. But more crucially, it might help preserve our deteriorating world. As I went through the notepad, my scientific expertise kicking in, I understood Dad had done it. He would answer issues that had baffled experts for decades, and the science and formulae were exquisite. This was not a failure's creation. This was brilliant. I was startled by a noise outside. When a vehicle drew up, light streamed over the windows. I was overcome with panic when I recalled Isabella's remarks. People were being sent by her to clean out the lab. They arrived early. I had to move quickly. On his desk, I noticed Dad's old laptop. It held his most crucial files, he had always informed me. I grabbed it in the notepad and scanned the lab quickly. What else would they ruin? Did I need to save anything else? Outside, the sound of voices prompted me to take action. I saw Dad's external hard disks in a drawer. Those two went inside my bag. Then, I saw a little safe behind his desk. I had never seen one like it. The mix. What might Dad have used? More voices, now closer, jingling keys, with shaky fingertips. I made an attempt at my birthday. Nothing. The front door doorknob began to rotate. Mom's birthday. No. In a desperate moment, the door opened. When Dad showed me the periodic table for the first time, I tried it. Our unique day. He made the call. The safe opened with a click. Hi there. From the front room came the voice of a guy, chin of the doctor. A tiny stack of documents that seemed to be patent applications and one USB disk with the labels philosophy and Dad's handwriting were found inside the safe. I gathered everything, stuffed it all in my suitcase, and desperately searched for a way out. The rear entrance? During risky experiments, Dad always kept it unlocked for emergency exits. Just as flashlights shone in the darkness in the main lab area, I snuck away. Around the corner, I sprinted to my car. I spotted men in black coats hauling boxes and equipment inside the lab as I was leaving. Isabella wasn't only tidying up the laboratory, she was looking for it. She was aware that I used a false identity to check into a modest motel that evening rather than going to my residence. I couldn't risk being discovered by Isabel's folks. Not until I knew what I had specifically. I started going through Dad's files after setting up his laptop. I stayed up till dawn because of what I discovered. Do you want me to go on to the second half, where we see what Sarah learns and how she starts to combat her stepmother's empire? My hand is still trembling after what I found the next morning. 3 important phone calls are made by me. The first was to Dr. Marcus John, an old MIT colleague of my father's, who had inexplicably retired the year Isabella evicted him from the house. The second was to my graduate school closest friend Maya Patel, who was now the head of a prominent environmental law company. The third was to one of the most successful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, my ex-boyfriend James Wilson. With a tone of astonishment in his voice, Sarah Chin James responded on the first ring. He put his profession above our relationship 2 years ago, and we hadn't talked since. I've heard about your dad. James, I'm very sorry. I need your assistance. Getting right to the point, I said. I need you to sign an NDA beforehand, though. I watched James's expression as he went over my father's statistics in a private conference room at his office an hour later. His face changed from one of doubt to one of shock to something that looked like Sarah. Here it is. He walked away, stroking his immaculately combed hair. Not only is this innovative, everything is altered by this. Just the carbon collection efficiency rates are 10 times higher than those of any other product available today, and the process of energy conversion. His eyes were big as he gazed up at me. Did your father really figure it out? Yes, I answered softly. There's more, though. I showed him the files that I had been deciphering all night. It wasn't simply the technologies Dad had created. He recorded each effort. Over the previous 5 years, Isabella and Chen Industries had stolen his research. Surveillance video, taped chats, and email threads. He retained everything. She attempted to compel him to give up the patents. I gave an explanation while displaying a particularly damaging series of emails. She began circulating allegations about his mental stability when he refused, stopped providing him with funds, and ultimately expelled him. However, she never gave up on obtaining his research. James whistled softly. Corporate espionage is what this is. This is serious business. He took a moment to examine me. What can I do for you? Capital for investments. Enough to launch a new business and accelerate its growth. Maya is already putting effort into getting the patents registered in my name. The initial paperwork had been filed by Dad prior to his passing, but before Isabel realizes what she's lost, we must act swiftly. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya before James could reply. Now 911 turns on CNBC. James turned on the conference rooms by grabbing the remote. TV mounted on the wall. Isabella stood at a podium in front of Chen Industries headquarters, her poised face filling the screen. I'm proud to share the news of Chen Industries' carbon capture technology breakthrough. Her voice was silky smooth as she spoke. The findings of my late husband's last project are outstanding, and we anticipate starting implementation this month. My blood froze. She was attempting to pass off her father's findings as her own. They were searching the lab for that reason. They're going to try to replicate his work, I muttered. James heard his phone ring. Even though Chen Industries' stock was already rising after the news, Isabella's press conference caught my attention and caused me to tilt forward. She misrepresented the chemical stabilization sequence that enables hitherto unheard-of carbon capture rates to the reporters. Totally incorrect. Dad's actual research was absent. They were bluffing with whatever incomplete notes they could find in the lab. Dr. John, my phone rang. I witnessed the press conference, he stated without introducing himself. She is in a difficult situation. Sarah, Chen Industries is in difficulty. They've been concealing up significant losses for years, employing innovative accounting to mask their failing initiatives. Your dad was aware. That's why Asbel was so eager to do his research. To keep the business solvent, she needs to win. I started to formulate a strategy. How soon can you assemble a team of researchers for David's daughter, Dr. Zhang? Let me have 48 hours. The following 2 weeks passed quickly. Isabella, however, enjoyed the publicity. We operated covertly. James arranged for us to have a lab in an unidentified building outside the city. To evade investigation, Maya registered trademarks and patents under a number of fictitious businesses. A group of talented scientists who had all been fired from Chen Industries throughout the years were brought together by Dr. Zhang. However, we had an issue. Dad's research was with us, but we needed evidence that Isabella had made a concerted effort to take it. Dad's laptop didn't have enough proof. We required up-to-date records on their corporate espionage. At that point, Vanessa's greed comes in handy. I received an unexpected call from my stepsister. Her tone, Sarah, sweet and syrupy. I've been reflecting on how terrible we've been to you, darling. Over lunch, I'll make it up to you. I accepted even though I know it's a trap. With its crystal chandeliers and rich wood, the restaurant she picked exuded old money. Vanessa had already arrived, dressed in clothing that most likely cost more than my annual wage. The way the funeral transpired makes me feel awful. She started pointing to the wine. And I'd want to assist you. Aid me. Naturally. I am aware that you must be having financial difficulties right now and, well, she leaned forward in a plot. I am aware that you possess something. Your mother is requesting something from your father's laboratory, and there it was. Mothers are willing to be quite generous if you assist us in reproducing your father's study. 7 figures. Generous. I sipped my wine. Purchasing time. What if I say no? A shark appeared in Vanessa's smile. Don't be hard on me, Sarah. In one way or another, Mother always gets what she wants. She was unaware that I was recording everything she said. Maya and I got together that afternoon to go over the tape. It's good, but we need more, she replied. We want evidence that Isabella is aware of how quickly she made her declaration. With that, I might be able to help. It came from the doorway in a low voice. Isabella's personal assistant, Liza, was standing there anxiously as we turned around. I've been employed by Mrs. Chan for a decade, she added. I have seen and done things. However, that goes too far to claim Dr. Chen's study. I have emails, internal notes, papers, and meeting recordings in which she specifically mentions stealing his work. Maya's eyes glowed. Are you prepared to testify? Lisa gave a nod. I was treated well by Dr. Chen. He was worthy of better. The pieces were coming together, but we needed to act quickly. Pre-orders for Chen Industries' non-existent carbon capture technology were already being accepted. Within a week, they had announced a demonstration for significant investors. We were about to set our trap. Are you certain about this? As we were ready for the last stage, James inquired. There is no turning back once we take this action. I remembered my father working by himself in his laboratory, steadfast in his moral convictions despite the consequences. Yes, I agreed. Let's put a stop to this. Do you want me to go on to part 3, where Sarah confronts Isabella at the investor demonstration after carrying out her plan? Clear skies greeted the day of Chen Industries' major showcase. The media was everywhere, and the corporation had booked out the most famous conference facility in San Francisco. The roadway was lined with news vans. As the most influential investors in the world came, reporters fought for space. From our own facility, where Dr. Zhang and our team were making last-minute tweaks to the actual carbon capture prototype, I watched the broadcast. For 2 weeks, we had been working non-stop to realize my father's vision, driven by coffee and a strong will to succeed. James remarked, straightening his tie as he had intended, "Everything's ready." He was a prospective investor who was at the demonstration. "The SEC agents are waiting, and Maya's squad is in place." I checked my phone and nodded. Lisa texted, "She feels anxious." Spent the entire morning rehearsing her speech. The technological intricacies are always evolving. Naturally, she felt anxious. Isabel was going to try to describe technology. Mrs. Chen wasn't really hers. The voice of a reporter entered the webcast. "Since revealing this innovation, the stock of your firm has increased by 300%. How would you respond to those who doubt the technology's viability?" Isabella's laugh was like glass shattering. "Hold off until the demonstration, in my opinion. The brilliance of my late spouse will speak for itself." Her cavalier exploitation of Dad's work made my fury boil, but I forced myself to remain composed. It all came down to time. At precisely 2 p.m., Isabella appeared on stage. Investors, members of the media, and members of the tech industry were crowded inside the conference hall. Vanessa sat smugly in the front row. Isabella started, "Ladies and gentlemen, in the battle against climate change, it is a historic day. Our world will be changed by Chen Industries' groundbreaking carbon capture technology." I had to respect her acting abilities as she threw herself into her presentation. She delivered the meticulously committed script flawlessly, speaking with assurance about molecular bonds and energy conversion rates. But when the audience began to ask questions, I could see the fear in her eyes. "Could you elaborate on the stabilization procedure?" a scientist inquired. Isabella smiled briefly. "Naturally, specialized molecular sequencing is a part of the process. However, how can deterioration be avoided during the conversion stage? Our proprietary technology was pressed by another expert." Isabella was having trouble starting. James got to his feet at that point. A demonstration might be more persuasive. Isabella was clearly relieved. "Yes, without a doubt. The enormous machine behind her comes to life if you focus on the main chamber." It had a striking appearance. Even though I knew it was merely for show, I had to give them that pulsing lights and gleaming metal. Isabella went on, "As you can see, the air's carbon dioxide is being drawn out and transformed into the machine." Made a terrible grinding noise before exploding. Alarms for emergencies started to sound. "Very minor technical issue," Isabella reassured the muttering audience. "Our engineers will." "Or perhaps," I exclaimed, as I rose from my spot at the rear of the hallway. "You tried to recreate technology you don't understand and stole unfinished research, which is why the machine doesn't work." There was silence in the room. As I approached the stage, Isabella's face turned pale. "Sarah," she hissed. "Why are you here? Isn't it obvious, Mother?" I continued, my voice carrying in the quiet room. "I'm here to demonstrate my father's actual technology." "Security!" Vanessa shouted. But before anyone could move, the convention center's doors opened. Maya's "Throw It In," followed by a team of FBI agents and SEC officials. "Isabella Chin," she announced. "You're under investigation for corporate fraud, espionage, and securities manipulation." "This is absurd," Isabella sputtered. "I have proof, documents." "Forged documents," Lisa remarked, coming forward. "I should know you made me produce them." The following hour was mayhem. While FBI officers secured Jin Industries' bogus prototype as evidence, Maya submitted our record of Isabella's scam. The emails, the recordings. Maya's team validated the transfer with Isabella's shares. I now owned what remained of Chen Industries, the corporation that had previously cast out. My father was now mine. The irony wasn't Asami. The next year brought developments I could never have envisaged. Chen Sustainable Technologies established our first large-scale carbon capture facility in California, with many more planned worldwide. The technique functioned better than even Dad had imagined, offering real hope in the fight against climate change. Vanessa signed a plea agreement and completed community service with an environmental cleaning group. The encounter appeared to transform her. She then created a charity focusing on sustainable clothes. My trusty head of staff was Liza, who had previously worked as Isabella's assistant. Her ability to stay organized is assisting us in managing our quick expansion. Isabella was incarcerated in a minimal security facility for 3 years. After being released, she relocated to a modest home in Montana, which was as far apart from her previous way of life as it could be. She occasionally writes me emails expressing sorrow and making an effort to explain things. I read them, but I don't always reply. I went to Dad's cemetery early on the first anniversary of his passing. The elaborate Chen family plot close by contrasted sharply with the plain headstone. "Dad, we succeeded." Placing fresh flowers at the stone, I replied quietly. "Your efforts are altering things and assisting others, as you've always desired." I attended a board meeting at our new headquarters that afternoon. With more than 1,000 workers, the company's market worth had risen to $50 billion. However, before entering the conference, I went to my office and opened my father's old notebook, which is now meticulously maintained in a glass case. Words he had penned years before appeared on the final page. "Success is determined by the constructive change we bring about, not by money or praise." Sarah, do you recall? Every day, while I stood gazing over the city, I did recall. I considered legacy. Isabella was determined to keep up the impression of prosperity. Therefore, she had built her empire on deceit. Dad had been devoted to realizing his aspirations while working in a modest lab. Ultimately, honesty and commitment have triumphed against deception and manipulation. False promises had been defeated by actual change. Another overseas contract, this one from India, buzzed on my phone. Additional chances to use Dad's invention to cut carbon emissions, to change things. Touching the plain locket I usually wore, I grinned. The one with the little scrap of paper from Dad's notepad on it. Remaining loyal to your values and allowing your work to speak for itself can sometimes lead to more success than harming others. I learned that from my father, and that was the most significant gift he could have given me. I was contributing to the positive change in the world because of him. He would have been more proud of it than all the billions in the world, I knew.